Abandoned by his wife, forgotten by his parents, and left to survive in the back of his truck, an injured veteran stumbled onto a hidden bunker beneath land he bought for $1,200, and what waited inside that cold stone chamber would be worth more than $260 million. Before we dive into the story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The morning frost clung to the windshield of the old Ford F-150 like a thin sheet of forgotten promises. Marcus Weber sat in the driver's seat, his breath visible in the cold Montana air, his leg throbbing with the kind of pain that never fully went away. He was 38 years old, but some mornings he felt closer to 70. The mountains in the distance were dusted with early snow, and the sun was just beginning to crawl over the ridgeline, spilling pale gold across the valley below. It should have been beautiful. Once he might have thought so, but Marcus had stopped noticing beauty a long time ago. He shifted in his seat, wincing as his left leg protested the movement. The doctors at the VA had told him he was lucky. Lucky the shrapnel hadn't severed the femoral artery. Lucky the blast hadn't taken the whole leg. Lucky he walked out of that convoy alive when two of his brothers didn't. Marcus never felt lucky. He felt hollow. He felt like a ghost wearing skin, wandering through a world that had moved on without him. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 12 years of service, a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and now a man living out of his truck with $47 in his checking account and a paper bag of beef jerky on the passenger seat. The medals were somewhere in a storage unit back in Oklahoma, the one he stopped paying for 6 months ago. He figured they'd auction off his things by now, let someone else carry the weight of those ribbons. He didn't want them anymore. Marcus reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled piece of paper. He unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear the edges. It was a tax deed issued by the county of Silver Bow, Montana. The document confirmed that he, Marcus James Weber, was now the legal owner of parcel number 7421, located 12 miles outside a town called Ridgecrest. The land had been seized for unpaid taxes years ago and sat forgotten on the county's surplus list. Nobody wanted it. Nobody bid on it. Until Marcus saw the listing online at a public library in Billings and submitted the minimum offer, $1,200. That was all he had left after selling his father's watch, the one piece of family he still carried. His father hadn't spoken to him in 4 years anyway. The watch meant nothing now. The land, at least, was something. A few acres, a collapsed farmhouse, and a chance to disappear from the world that had already forgotten him. He started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road heading west. The truck groaned beneath him, the suspension worn, the heater barely functioning. But it had carried him this far. From the VA hospital in Texas, through Oklahoma, where his mother refused to open the door, across Wyoming, where he spent 3 nights parked behind a truck stop, too ashamed to ask for help. And now here, into the wild silence of Montana, where nobody knew his name and nobody cared if he lived or died. The road wound through the valley like a scar through green and brown. Pine trees rose on either side, their branches heavy with early snow. There were no other cars, no signs of life, just the hum of the engine and the occasional cry of a hawk circling above. Marcus liked the silence. It was the only thing that didn't remind him of what he lost. He thought about Sarah. He always thought about Sarah, even when he tried not to. She had been his wife for 6 years, his best friend for longer. She was the one who wrote letters to him during his first deployment, the one who kissed him at the airport when he came home, the one who promised forever in a small church in Tulsa with daisies in her hair. He believed her. God help him, he believed every word. But forever didn't survive 3 tours. Forever didn't survive the nightmares, the drinking, the silence that grew between them like a wall neither could climb. She tried. He knew that now. She tried longer than most would. But when he came back from his last deployment, broken in ways the doctors couldn't see. She looked at him like he was already gone. And maybe he was. She left 2 months after he got home. Took their daughter Emma with her. Emma was only 5 at the time. She didn't understand why Daddy couldn't play anymore, why he flinched at loud noises, why he spent hours staring out the window at nothing. She just knew he was different. And different to a child was scary. Sarah didn't fight him in court. She didn't have to. Marcus signed over everything, the house, the savings, even his visitation rights. He told himself it was for Emma's sake, that she deserved stability, that she was better off without a father who woke up screaming and forgot what day it was. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He didn't believe he deserved to be her father anymore. He hadn't seen Emma in 3 years. Hadn't heard her voice in 2. She was 8 now, maybe 9. He couldn't remember her birthday anymore, and that shamed him more than anything else. Marcus turned off the main road and onto a gravel path barely wide enough for the truck. The trees closed in around him, branches scraping the roof like skeletal fingers. According to the deed, the property was another half-mile ahead. He didn't know what to expect. The listing had described it as a rural homestead, unimproved, with structures in disrepair. That could mean anything from a run-down cabin to a pile of ash. When the trees finally parted, Marcus slowed the truck and stared. The farmhouse, if you could still call it that, had collapsed in on itself like a man who had given up on standing. The roof had caved in years ago, and the walls leaned at impossible angles. Weeds had reclaimed the foundation, and vines crawled up the remaining beams like nature was trying to erase the memory of what once stood there. Behind the house, a rusted barn tilted dangerously to one side, its doors hanging open like a mouth frozen mid-scream. Beyond that, the land stretched flat and wild, bordered by thick forest on 3 sides and a rocky hillside to the north. Marcus parked the truck and stepped out, his boots sinking into the soft earth. The air was sharp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and wet soil. He stood there for a long moment, just breathing, letting the silence wrap around him like a blanket. This was his now, all of it, the broken house, the leaning barn, the wild acres. For the first time in years, something belonged to him. He didn't feel joy. He didn't feel relief. He just felt tired. But tired, at least, was familiar. He spent the next few hours walking the property, cataloguing what remained. The farmhouse was beyond saving, but some of the wood might still be useful. The barn was sturdier than it looked, and with some work it could serve as shelter until he figured out something better. There was a well behind the house, rusted but possibly functional. And the land itself, though overgrown, was flat enough to clear for a garden or a small campsite. Marcus had no grand plans. He didn't dream of building something new or starting over. He just wanted a place to exist, quietly, without the weight of expectations or the pity of strangers. If he could make it through the winter here, that would be enough. One season at a time, one day at a time. That was all he could manage. As the sun climbed higher, he made his way toward the back of the property, near the hillside. The grass here was taller, thick and tangled, and he had to push through it like wading through water. His leg ached with every step, but he kept moving, driven by a vague curiosity he couldn't explain. Something about the way the land rose toward the rocks felt intentional, like it was hiding something. He almost missed it. Beneath a tangle of dead brush and fallen branches, half buried in years of dirt and debris, there was a shape that didn't belong. Metal, dull and rusted, but unmistakably metal. Marcus knelt down, ignoring the sharp protest from his knee, and began pulling away the brush. His hands worked quickly, instinctively, the way they used to when clearing debris from a bombed-out building. What emerged was a hatch. It was about 4 feet wide, rectangular, and made of heavy steel. The surface was pitted with rust and covered in grime, but the hinges were still intact. And there, stamped into the metal near the edge, was a symbol Marcus recognized immediately. A civil defense emblem, the same kind he had seen in old military manuals and Cold War documentaries. This wasn't a root cellar or a storm shelter. This was something else entirely. His heart began to pound, not from fear, but from something closer to recognition. He had spent years of his life in places built for war. He knew what fortified construction looked like. He knew the difference between civilian work and military-grade engineering. This hatch wasn't built by a farmer. It was built by someone who expected the world to end. Marcus sat back on his heels and stared at the rusted steel. His breath came in slow, measured pulls. The rational part of his brain told him to leave it alone, to walk away, to focus on the barn and the well and the things he could actually use. But the soldier in him, the part that never quite went to sleep, wanted to know what was underneath. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his multi-tool, a battered Leatherman he had carried since his first deployment. The blade was dull, but the pry bar still worked. He jammed it into the seam between the hatch and the frame and pushed down with all his weight. The metal groaned, rust flaked away like dried blood, and then, with a sound like a sigh, the hatch cracked open. Stale air rushed up from below, cold and dry, carrying the scent of dust and something else, something metallic and ancient. Marcus pulled the hatch fully open and peered into the darkness. Stone steps led down, carved directly into the earth, descending into shadow. The walls of the stairwell were reinforced with concrete, smooth and grey, untouched by time. For a long moment, Marcus didn't move. He just stared into the black, listening to the silence that rose up to meet him. Whatever was down there had been sealed away for decades, maybe longer. And now, for reasons he couldn't begin to understand, it was his. He pulled his flashlight from his coat and clicked it on. The beam cut through the darkness like a blade, illuminating the stairs and the walls and the depth that waited below. His legs screamed at him to stop, to sit down, to rest. But Marcus had never been good at listening to pain. Pain was just noise, and noise could be ignored. He took the first step. The stairs were steep but solid, each one carved with precision. He counted them as he went, an old habit from his days clearing buildings in Kandahar. 15 steps down, then a turn to the left. Another 10 steps, narrower now, the ceiling pressing lower. The air grew colder with each step, and the silence became something physical, something he could feel against his skin. At the bottom, the stairwell opened into a corridor. The walls here were reinforced with steel beams, and the floor was smooth concrete, swept clean by some long-forgotten hand. The flashlight revealed doors on either side, heavy and sealed, each one marked with faded stencils. Supply room A, generator room, communications. The labels were military in style, utilitarian and precise. Marcus moved slowly, his boots echoing in the stillness. He checked each door as he passed, but none of them opened. They were locked or rusted shut, frozen in place by decades of neglect. He didn't force them. Something told him the real discovery wasn't behind these doors. It was ahead. The corridor ended at a larger door, different from the others. This one was made of stone, or at least it appeared to be. Thick slabs of grey rock, fitted together with iron bands, like something out of a medieval fortress. But set into the center was a modern lock, a combination dial, and beneath it, a brass plate engraved with a name. Howard Ellsworth Callahan, 1919 to 1987. Marcus stared at the name. He didn't recognize it. But something about the engraving, the care with which it had been made, told him that whoever Howard Callahan was, this place had mattered to him. This wasn't just a bunker. It was a tomb, a monument, a secret kept for nearly 40 years. And now, standing alone in the cold silence, Marcus Weber was the first person to see it. He reached out and touched the stone. It was cool beneath his fingers, solid and real. And somewhere deep inside him, in a place he thought had died years ago, something stirred. Curiosity. wonder, the faintest spark of hope. He didn't know what was behind this door. He didn't know if it would change anything or mean anything or matter to anyone but him. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus wanted to find out. He studied the combination lock. It was old, mechanical, the kind used in bank vaults and military installations before digital systems took over. He had no idea what the code might be. But as he examined the dial, he noticed something scratched into the brass plate beneath the name. Numbers, faint but legible. 07-17-1945, a date, July 17, 1945. Marcus didn't know its significance, but he had nothing to lose. He turned the dial slowly, aligning the numbers with the indicator. The mechanism clicked once, twice, 3 times. And then, with a deep metallic groan, the stone door began to move. It didn't swing open like a normal door. Instead, it slid sideways, grinding against the floor with a sound that echoed through the corridor like distant thunder. Dust poured from the seams, and the air that rushed out was even colder than before, ancient and untouched. Marcus raised his flashlight and stepped through the threshold. What he saw stopped him in his tracks. The chamber beyond was massive, larger than any room he had expected to find underground. The ceiling arched high above, supported by stone pillars carved with intricate patterns. The walls were lined with metal shelving, and on those shelves sat rows of sealed crates, stacked neatly, each one marked with numbers and letters that meant nothing to him. In the center of the room, a heavy wooden desk sat beneath a single hanging lamp, its bulb long dead. Papers were scattered across its surface, yellowed and fragile, and beyond the desk, against the far wall, stood a vault door, massive, black, and slightly ajar. Marcus's breath caught in his throat. He moved toward the desk first, his eyes scanning the papers. Some were letters, written in a careful hand. Others were financial documents, ledgers, and inventory lists, and all of them bore the same name, Howard Ellsworth Callahan. He picked up one of the letters and read it by flashlight. "To whoever finds this place," it began, "know that I built it not out of fear, but out of duty. I have seen what war does to nations. I have seen what greed does to men. And I have spent my life preparing for the day when the world would need what I have gathered here. If that day has come, then use it wisely. If it has not, then perhaps there is still hope for us all." The letter was dated March 14, 1986, just over a year before Howard Callahan died. Marcus set the letter down and turned toward the vault. His hands were trembling now, not from cold but from something deeper. Anticipation, terror, the sense that his life was about to split into 2 halves, before this moment and after. He walked to the vault door and pulled it open. The hinges groaned, but they moved, and as the door swung wide, the beam of his flashlight fell upon something that made his knees buckle. Gold, rows upon rows of gold bars stacked on steel pallets, gleaming faintly in the light. And beside them, crates of silver coins, bundles of old currency, boxes of bearer bonds, and cases of what looked like rare gems, each one catalogued and sealed. Marcus sank to the floor, his back against the cold stone wall. His chest heaved, his vision blurred. He pressed his hands to his face and felt the wetness of tears he hadn't known were falling. For years he had believed he was worthless, that the world had chewed him up and spit him out, that everything he had fought for, everything he had sacrificed, meant nothing. He had lost his wife, lost his daughter, lost his home, his health, his hope. He had been abandoned by the people who were supposed to love him, left to rot in a broken truck on the side of the road like a piece of garbage no one wanted to pick up. And now, in the cold silence of a forgotten bunker, surrounded by more wealth than he had ever imagined, Marcus Weber finally allowed himself to feel the weight of everything he had carried. He didn't know how long he sat there, minutes, maybe hours. The flashlight flickered once, then steadied. The silence pressed in around him, patient and absolute. And somewhere, in the deepest part of his soul, a voice whispered something he hadn't heard in years. "Maybe you're not finished yet." Marcus wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and forced himself to stand. His legs screamed in protest, but he ignored it. He walked back to the desk, picked up the ledger that sat at its center, and opened it. Inside, every item in the bunker was listed. Every bar of gold, every crate of silver, every bond, every coin, every gem. And at the bottom of the final page, written in the same careful hand as the letter, was a single line. Estimated total value as of January 1987, $42 million, adjusted for future inflation and market value, incalculable. Marcus closed the ledger and held it against his chest. He didn't understand how this had happened. Didn't understand why the land had gone unclaimed for so long, why no one had found this place, why the universe had led a broken man to a buried fortune. But he knew one thing for certain. His life would never be the same. He climbed the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. When he emerged into the fading daylight, the air felt different, sharper, more alive. He sealed the hatch behind him, covering it with brush and debris, his hands working on instinct. Then he walked back to his truck, sat in the driver's seat, and stared out at the collapsing farmhouse, the leaning barn, the wild and tangled land that now belonged to him. $1,200. That was all it had cost, and beneath his feet, buried in stone and silence, lay more than $260 million in forgotten treasure, and a second chance he never thought he'd get. Marcus leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he didn't dream of fire or blood or the faces of men he couldn't save. He dreamed of nothing at all, and in that emptiness something new began to grow. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He sat in the cab of his truck with the engine off and the windows cracked, listening to the wind move through the pine trees like whispered secrets. The temperature dropped into the low 20s, and his breath hung in the air like smoke, but he barely noticed the cold. His mind was somewhere else entirely. It was still underground, still standing in that stone chamber, still staring at rows of gold that gleamed like frozen sunlight. Every few minutes he would glance toward the spot where the hatch lay hidden beneath the brush. Part of him expected it to vanish, to dissolve like a fever dream, to prove that none of it was real. But the hatch remained. The bunker remained. And the weight of what he had discovered pressed down on his chest like a stone slab. $260 million, maybe more. He couldn't process it. His brain simply refused to make sense of the number. For years he had counted pennies. He had rationed gas. He had skipped meals so he could afford a motel room during the worst nights of winter. He had stood in line at food banks with his eyes on the floor, ashamed to be seen, ashamed to need help. And now, buried beneath a piece of land he had bought for $1,200, sat a fortune that could buy entire towns. The irony was almost cruel. Marcus pressed his palms against his eyes and exhaled slowly. He needed to think. He needed to plan. But his thoughts kept scattering like startled birds, refusing to land on anything solid. What was he supposed to do? Who was he supposed to call? He didn't have a lawyer. He didn't have an accountant. He didn't even have a phone that worked half the time. The prepaid cell in his glove box had maybe 15 minutes of talk time left, and the nearest town was over 20 miles away. He thought about driving to Ridgecrest and finding someone to help. But the moment the thought formed, he dismissed it. Small towns talked. People noticed strangers. If he walked into a bank or a courthouse asking questions about buried treasure and tax deeds, word would spread before he made it back to his truck. And then what? Then everyone would know. Then people would come. People with lawyers and guns and claims he couldn't fight. Marcus had survived 3 combat deployments. He had walked through fire and watched friends die in his arms. But the idea of facing a legal battle over something he didn't understand terrified him more than any enemy combatant ever had. Because in war, at least he knew the rules. He knew who the enemy was. But this was something else entirely. This was a world of fine print and loopholes, of men in suits who could take everything with the stroke of a pen. He couldn't let that happen. Not yet. Not until he understood what he was dealing with. When the first light of dawn began to creep over the mountains, Marcus made a decision. He would go back down. He would document everything. He would read every letter, every ledger, every scrap of paper that Howard Callahan had left behind. And then, when he knew the full truth of what lay beneath his feet, he would figure out his next move. He climbed out of the truck, his legs stiff and aching from the cold. The morning air bit at his face, sharp and clean, and his breath came out in thick white clouds. He stretched slowly, working the knots out of his back, then grabbed his flashlight and headed toward the hatch. The brush was still in place, undisturbed. He pulled it away carefully, revealing the rusted steel beneath. The hatch opened easier this time, the hinges loosened by yesterday's effort. Marcus descended into the darkness once more, the beam of his flashlight cutting a path through the black. The corridor felt different in the early morning, quieter somehow, more sacred. He moved slowly, reverently, his boots echoing against the concrete floor. When he reached the stone door at the end of the passage, he paused and ran his fingers across the engraved name. Howard Ellsworth Callahan. Who were you? Marcus wondered. What made you build all this? What were you so afraid of? He pushed the door open and stepped into the chamber. The gold was still there. Of course it was, but in the pale glow of his flashlight, it looked different than it had the day before. Less like a dream, more like a responsibility. Marcus walked past the pallets of bullion and approached the wooden desk at the center of the room. The papers were still scattered across its surface, and the ledger still sat where he had left it, closed and waiting. He pulled out the chair, a heavy oak thing with a cracked leather seat, and sat down. For a long moment, he simply breathed. Then he opened the ledger and began to read. The first pages were inventory lists, written in neat columns with dates and figures. Gold bars measured in troy ounces, silver coins sorted by year and mint, bearer bonds issued by corporations that no longer existed. The entries spanned decades, starting in 1952 and continuing until 1986. Howard Callahan had been collecting for over 30 years, methodically, patiently, building his underground treasury one acquisition at a time. But it was the later pages that told the real story. Marcus found letters addressed to no one in particular, written in a hand that grew shakier as the years progressed. They were part confession, part manifesto, part final testament from a man who knew his time was running out. I was born in 1919, one letter began, in a small town in Ohio that no longer exists. My father worked the steel mills until the crash took everything. I watched my mother sell her wedding ring for bread. I swore then that I would never be powerless again. Marcus turned the page. I served in the war, the big one. I saw what happened when nations collapsed, when currency became worthless, when men killed each other for scraps of food. I came home with medals and nightmares, and I decided that if the world ever fell apart again, I would be ready. Another page. I made my fortune in manufacturing. Machine parts, mostly. Nothing glamorous, but steady. I never married, never had children. I told myself it was because I didn't have time, but the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid of loving something I might lose. Afraid of bringing life into a world I didn't trust. Marcus's throat tightened. He understood that fear. He had felt it every day since Emma was born. I built this shelter in 1951 when the Soviets tested their first bomb. I told myself it was prudent, practical, but it became something else. It became my obsession. Every dollar I earned, I converted into something tangible. Gold, silver, gems, things that would hold value when paper money turned to ash. The letters continued, spanning years. Howard wrote about the Cuban Missile Crisis, about the fear that gripped the nation, about the nights he spent underground, waiting for sirens that never came. He wrote about the Vietnam War, about Watergate, about the hostage crisis in Iran. Each event confirmed his belief that collapse was inevitable. Each crisis drove him deeper into his preparations. But then, in the final letters, something shifted. "I am 70 years old now," Howard wrote in 1986. "My doctors tell me I have perhaps a year left. The cancer has spread too far. I have spent my entire life preparing for a disaster that never came. And now, as I face my own end, I wonder if I was wrong." Marcus leaned closer, his flashlight trembling slightly. "I built this place out of fear, but fear is a poor foundation. It keeps you alive, but it doesn't let you live. I have no heirs, no family, no one to pass this burden to, and so I leave it here, sealed in stone, waiting for whoever finds it." The final letter was dated March 14, 1986, the same date Marcus had seen the night before. "To whoever reads these words, I do not know who you are or what brought you here, but I hope you are braver than I was. I hope you use what I have gathered not to hide, but to build, not to fear, but to hope. The world did not end in my lifetime. Perhaps it never will. But if there is even a small chance that these resources can do good, real good, then my life will not have been wasted." The letter ended with a simple signature: Howard Ellsworth Callahan, veteran, builder, fool. Marcus set the letter down and stared at the wall. His eyes burned. His chest ached with something he couldn't name. This man, this stranger who had died nearly 40 years ago, had spent his entire life alone, afraid, preparing for a catastrophe that never came. And now his fortune, his life's work, his monument to fear, had fallen into the hands of another broken man, another veteran, another soul who had lost everything and didn't know how to find his way back. It felt like fate, or maybe it felt like a test. Marcus stood and walked toward the vault. The door was still ajar from the night before, and the beam of his flashlight illuminated the stacks of gold within. He stepped inside and began to count. 24 pallets of gold bars. Each pallet held 12 bars. Each bar weighed approximately 400 troy ounces. He did the math in his head, rough and imprecise, but enough to understand the scale. At current market prices, the gold alone was worth well over $150 million, and that was just the beginning. He moved to the crates of silver. There were dozens of them, each one packed with coins dating back to the early 20th century. Some were American eagles, others were Morgan dollars, walking liberties, peace dollars. Many were still in their original mint packaging, untouched for decades. The numismatic value alone was staggering. Beyond the silver, he found boxes of bearer bonds, financial instruments that had been outlawed years ago, but still held value if authenticated. There were bundles of old currency, some dating back to the Civil War, preserved in airtight containers. And in a smaller vault within the vault, he discovered cases of gemstones, diamonds, rubies, emeralds, each one catalogued and appraised. Marcus spent hours going through it all. He photographed everything with his dying phone, careful to capture the markings, the dates, the serial numbers. He filled a small notebook with figures and estimates, cross-referencing the ledger whenever he could. By the time he finished, his hands were shaking and his head was spinning. The total value, conservatively estimated, was over $260 million. What happens next will turn this night upside down, reveal a truth nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. Marcus climbed the stairs slowly, his body heavy with exhaustion and his mind heavy with questions. He emerged into the afternoon light and sealed the hatch behind him, covering it once more with brush and debris. Then he walked to his truck, sat on the tailgate, and stared out at the empty land. He thought about what Howard had written. Use it to build. Not to fear, but to hope. Easy words to write, harder to live. Marcus had spent years afraid of his own memories, afraid of the future, afraid of the man he had become and the man he might never be again. He had lost his family not because they abandoned him, but because he had pushed them away. He had told himself it was for their own good, that they were better off without him. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He had been too scared to let them see him broken. And now here he was, alone in the wilderness, sitting on top of a fortune that could change his life or destroy it. The smart thing to do would be to sell it all. Quietly, piece by piece, through private dealers who wouldn't ask too many questions. He could disappear, buy a cabin somewhere remote, live out his days in silence far from the world that had hurt him. But even as the thought formed, it felt hollow, because running was what he had always done. Running was how he had ended up here in the first place. Howard Callahan had run too. He had hidden underground, surrounded by gold, waiting for a disaster that never came. And he had died alone, his fortune sealed in stone, his life reduced to a cautionary tale written in fading ink. Marcus didn't want to be another cautionary tale, but he didn't know how to be anything else. That night, he drove into Ridgecrest for the first time. The town was small, maybe 2,000 people, built along a single main street lined with brick buildings and faded storefronts. There was a diner, a hardware store, a bar with neon signs in the window. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone and strangers stood out like sore thumbs. Marcus parked near the diner and went inside. The warmth hit him like a wave, and the smell of coffee and fried food made his stomach growl. He hadn't eaten a real meal in days. He slid into a booth near the back and ordered a burger, fries, and black coffee. The waitress was young, maybe early 20s, with kind eyes and a name tag that said Molly. She didn't ask questions, just brought his food and refilled his cup without being asked. He ate slowly, savoring every bite. Around him, the diner hummed with quiet conversation. Farmers talking about the weather, an old couple sharing a slice of pie, a group of teenagers laughing over milkshakes. Normal life, ordinary life, the kind of life Marcus had forgotten existed. When he finished, he paid in cash and left a generous tip, the first time he had been able to afford generosity in years. Then he walked to the payphone outside the hardware store and stood there for a long time, receiver in hand, trying to remember the number. It came to him slowly, digit by digit, dredged up from a memory he had tried to bury. He dialed. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. "Hello?" Marcus's throat closed. He hadn't heard that voice in 4 years. "Hello?" the voice repeated, impatient now. "Who is this?" Marcus opened his mouth, but no words came out. What was he supposed to say? "I'm sorry. I found a fortune. I'm still alive." The line went dead. He stood there for another minute, the receiver pressed against his ear, listening to the silence. Then he hung up and walked back to his truck. The drive back to the property felt longer than it had before. The mountains loomed dark against the sky, and the stars seemed impossibly far away. Marcus parked near the collapsed farmhouse and sat in the cab, engine off, staring at nothing. He thought about his mother, about the door that hadn't opened, about the years of silence that stretched between them like an ocean he couldn't cross. He thought about Sarah, about Emma, about the family he had walked away from because he believed they were better off without him. He thought about Howard Callahan, alone in his bunker, surrounded by gold and fear and regret. And he thought about himself, about the man he had been and the man he might still become. Sometime after midnight, Marcus made another decision. He couldn't do this alone. He needed help. Someone he could trust, someone who understood what it meant to carry weight that no one else could see. There was one person, just one. A man he had met at a VA support group in Texas years ago. A retired JAG lawyer named Walter Hines, who had served in Vietnam and spent his career helping veterans navigate the legal system. Walter was sharp, honest, and unafraid of complicated situations. He was also the only person Marcus had ever told about his darkest days, the only person who had listened without judgment. Marcus hadn't spoken to Walter in over 2 years, but he still had his number, written on a scrap of paper tucked into his wallet. He pulled out the paper and stared at it in the dim light. "Tomorrow," he told himself. "Tomorrow I'll call." But even as he made the promise, doubt crept in. What if Walter didn't remember him? What if he thought Marcus was crazy? What if he reported the discovery to someone who would take it all away? Trust was a foreign concept now. Marcus had learned the hard way that people let you down, that promises meant nothing, that the only person you could rely on was yourself. But himself wasn't enough anymore. Himself was broken and lost and barely holding together. If he was going to do something meaningful with what he had found, if he was going to honor Howard's final wish, he needed more than his own 2 hands. He needed help, and that terrified him more than anything he had faced in combat. Marcus leaned his head back against the seat and closed his eyes. The wind had picked up outside, rattling the truck and bending the trees. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled at the moon. He didn't dream that night either, but for the first time in years he didn't dread the morning, because tomorrow everything would change, one way or another. The next morning dawned cold and grey, with clouds hanging low over the mountains like a shroud. Marcus woke stiff and sore, his leg throbbing from another night in the truck. He ate the last of his beef jerky and drank water from a plastic bottle that had frozen overnight. Then he drove back to Ridgecrest and found the payphone again. This time, he didn't hesitate. He dialed Walter's number and waited. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Walter Hines speaking. Marcus exhaled. "Walter, it's Marcus Weber. We met at the VA group in San Antonio a few years back." There was a pause, then, "Marcus, I remember you. It's been a long time." "Yeah, it has." Another pause. "You okay, son?" Marcus laughed, short and bitter. "I don't know. Maybe. I need help, Walter. Legal help. I found something big, and I don't know what to do." Walter's voice shifted, sharper now. "What kind of something?" Marcus looked around the empty street, then lowered his voice. "I bought a piece of land in Montana, tax auction, $1,200. There's a bunker underneath it, Cold War era, and inside that bunker—" He paused, struggling to find the words. "There's a fortune. Gold, silver, bonds, gems. The man who built it died almost 40 years ago. No heirs, no claims. It's just been sitting there, waiting." Silence on the other end. "Walter, you still there?" "I'm here," Walter said slowly. "You're telling me you found a buried vault full of treasure, and you want to know if it's legally yours?" "Yeah, that's what I'm telling you." Another long pause. Marcus could almost hear Walter thinking, calculating, weighing the possibilities. "Where exactly are you?" "Ridgecrest, Montana, little town about 20 miles from the property." "And you haven't told anyone else?" "No, no one." Walter exhaled heavily. "Okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to stay quiet. Don't talk to anyone. Don't show anyone. Don't even hint at what you found. I'm going to make some calls, look into the property records, check for any outstanding claims or liens. If everything is clean, and that's a big if, then we'll talk about next steps." Marcus nodded, even though Walter couldn't see him. "How long?" "Give me a week, maybe 2. These things take time, especially with properties that have been abandoned for decades. In the meantime, keep your head down and your mouth shut. Can you do that?" "Yeah," Marcus said. "I can do that." "Good. And Marcus?" "Yeah?" "Whatever you found down there, don't let it change who you are. I've seen what money does to people. It doesn't solve problems, it just makes them bigger. Marcus thought about Howard Callahan, alone in his vault, surrounded by gold and regret. "I know," he said quietly. "Believe me, I know." He hung up the phone and stood there for a moment, the cold wind biting at his face. Then he walked back to his truck, climbed inside, and drove toward the property that held a secret worth more than he could comprehend. The road stretched out before him, empty and endless. And for the first time in years, Marcus Weber allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the road was leading somewhere worth going. The days that followed were the longest of Marcus's life. He had promised Walter he would stay quiet, keep his head down, and wait. But waiting had never been his strength. In the army, waiting meant danger. Waiting meant ambush. Waiting meant death, creeping closer while you sat helpless, unable to act. And now, sitting alone on a piece of land that held a secret worth more than most people would see in 100 lifetimes, the waiting felt like suffocation. He tried to keep busy. He cleared brush from around the collapsed farmhouse, salvaging what lumber he could. He patched holes in the barn roof with sheets of corrugated metal he found rusting behind the structure. He dug out the old well and discovered, to his surprise, that it still held water, cold and clear, and tasting faintly of minerals. Small victories, tiny steps toward making the land livable. But every few hours, his eyes would drift toward the hidden hatch, and the weight of what lay beneath would press down on him like a physical force. He rationed his money carefully. The $47 he had started with was nearly gone, but he had found a few hundred more in his truck, cash he had forgotten about, stuffed into the glove box months ago during a particularly bad week. He used it sparingly, driving into Ridgecrest every few days for supplies. Canned food, bottled water, a cheap sleeping bag from the hardware store. The nights were getting colder, and his truck offered little protection against the Montana winter that was creeping closer with each passing day. The townspeople noticed him, of course. Strangers always stood out in places like Ridgecrest. He caught curious glances at the diner, heard whispers at the gas station, but no one approached him directly. They were polite in the way that small-town people often are, friendly enough to nod, cautious enough to keep their distance. Marcus preferred it that way. The less attention he drew, the better. But attention, he would soon learn, had a way of finding you whether you wanted it or not. It started with a knock. Marcus was inside the barn trying to rig a makeshift heating system from an old propane tank he had found when he heard the sound. 3 sharp raps against the barn door, deliberate and unhurried. He froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the wrench at his belt, a poor weapon, but better than nothing. "Hello?" a voice called out. Male, older, unfamiliar. "Anyone in there?" Marcus didn't answer. He moved silently toward the door, positioning himself where he could see without being seen. Through a crack in the wood, he spotted a man standing outside. Late 60s, maybe early 70s. White hair, weathered face, wearing a canvas jacket and work boots. He didn't look threatening. He looked like every other farmer Marcus had seen in town. "I know someone's in there," the man continued. "Saw your truck. Just wanted to introduce myself. Name's Earl Hensley. I own the property next to yours, about 2 miles east." Marcus hesitated. Then, against his better judgment, he pushed open the barn door and stepped into the pale afternoon light. Earl Hensley smiled, revealing teeth stained by decades of coffee and tobacco. "There you are. Thought maybe you were a ghost. Folks in town have been talking about the stranger out at the old Callahan place." Marcus stiffened at the name. "Callahan?" "That's what we used to call it," Earl said, nodding toward the collapsed farmhouse. "Before it went to the county. Howard Callahan owned this land for decades, hermit type, kept to himself, died back in, must have been 87 or so. Place has been sitting empty ever since." Marcus forced his expression to remain neutral. "I bought it at auction. Tax deed." "So I heard. Earl's eyes swept over the property, lingering on the barn, the well, the overgrown fields. Most folks thought the county would just let it rot. Nobody wanted it. Too remote, too much work. But here you are. Here I am, Marcus agreed. Earl studied him for a moment, his gaze sharp despite his friendly demeanor. You a veteran? The question caught Marcus off guard. How did you know? The way you carry yourself, the way you positioned yourself before opening that door. I did 2 tours in Vietnam, 68 and 69. You learn to recognize your own. Marcus felt something shift in his chest, a small crack in the wall he had built around himself. Army, 3 tours, Afghanistan. Earl nodded slowly. Rough country. Lost my nephew over there. 2010, Ayyad outside Kandahar. I'm sorry. Me too. Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. Look, I don't know why you're out here or what you're running from. That's your business. But if you ever need anything, supplies, tools, someone to talk to, you come find me. Veterans look out for each other. That's how it's supposed to work. Marcus took the card. The paper was worn, the ink faded, but the gesture felt genuine. Thank you. Earl tipped an invisible hat. Welcome to the neighborhood, son, such as it is. Then he turned and walked back toward the tree line, disappearing into the forest as quietly as he had come. Marcus stood there for a long time after he left, the business card clutched in his hand. It had been years since anyone had offered him help without wanting something in return. He didn't know how to feel about it, but he tucked the card into his wallet anyway. The call from Walter came 8 days later. Marcus was sitting in his truck, eating a cold can of beans and watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of fire when his phone buzzed. He almost dropped the can in his haste to answer. Walter? It's me, the familiar voice confirmed. I've got news, some good, some complicated. Marcus's heart hammered against his ribs. Tell me. First, the good. The property is clean. The tax deed is legitimate. Howard Callahan died intestate, that means without a will, in 1987. He had no surviving spouse, no children, no siblings. The county seized the land for unpaid taxes in 1992 and held it in surplus until you bought it last month. Legally, everything beneath that soil belongs to you. Marcus exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. And the complicated part? Walter paused. There's a distant relative, a man named Preston Whitmore. He's Callahan's great-nephew, twice removed or something like that. Lives in Seattle now. Apparently he's been aware of the property for years but never bothered to claim it. Figured it was worthless. And now? Now he's filed a motion with the county to contest the sale. Claims the auction wasn't properly advertised, that he should have been notified as a potential heir. Marcus's stomach dropped. Can he do that? He can try, but here's the thing. He doesn't have much of a case. The county followed proper procedure. The notice was published in the local paper for the required period. Whitmore had decades to come forward, and he didn't. In my opinion, his claim is weak, but what? But he's got money, and money buys lawyers, good ones. He's already retained a firm out of Billings, and they're making noise about dragging this into court. Marcus closed his eyes. Of course there would be someone else, someone with resources, someone who could afford to fight in ways he never could. What do I do? For now, nothing. The burden of proof is on him. He has to show that the sale was improper, and that's a high bar to clear. But Marcus, Walter's voice grew serious. If he finds out what's actually on that property, everything changes. Right now, he thinks he's fighting over a few acres of scrubland. If he learns about the bunker, about what's inside, he'll throw everything he has at this. And I mean everything. Marcus stared out at the fading light, his mind racing. So I keep quiet. You keep quiet. You don't talk to anyone, you don't show anyone, and you definitely don't start selling anything. Not yet. Not until this is resolved. How long? Could be weeks, could be months. These things move slowly, especially when lawyers are involved. Marcus thought about the gold sitting in the darkness below. $260 million gathering dust while lawyers argued over paperwork. It felt absurd. It felt unfair. It felt exactly like the kind of thing that would happen to him. "Okay," he said finally. "I'll wait." "Good. And Marcus, stay strong. You've survived worse than this." The line went dead. Marcus set the phone down and stared at the mountains until the last light faded and the stars began to emerge, cold and indifferent above. The next few weeks were a study in patience and paranoia. Marcus kept to himself, venturing into town only when absolutely necessary. He avoided conversations, deflected questions, and pretended to be nothing more than a down-on-his-luck drifter trying to make an abandoned property livable. Most people accepted the story without question, but not everyone. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning. Marcus was clearing brush near the hatch, being careful to keep it hidden, but also wanting to ensure he could access it quickly if needed, when he heard the sound of an engine approaching. He straightened up, wiping dirt from his hands, and watched as a black SUV rolled up the gravel drive. It wasn't Earl's truck. It wasn't anyone he recognized. The SUV stopped about 50 feet away, and two men stepped out. One was young, maybe 30, wearing a tailored suit that looked absurdly out of place against the backdrop of wild Montana. The other was older, heavier, with the kind of face that suggested he spent more time in boardrooms than in nature. Both of them wore expressions of casual authority, the look of men who were used to getting what they wanted. Marcus didn't move. He just watched as they approached. "Marcus Weber?" the older man asked. "Who's asking?" The man smiled without warmth. "My name is Richard Cole. I'm an attorney representing Preston Whitmore. I believe you've been informed of Mr. Whitmore's interest in this property." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I've been informed." "Good. Then you know that Mr. Whitmore has a legitimate claim to this land, a claim that predates your acquisition." Cole said the word like it left a bad taste in his mouth. "I know he filed a motion," Marcus replied evenly. "I also know it hasn't gone anywhere." Cole's smile flickered. "Not yet, but these things take time. In the meantime, Mr. Whitmore wanted me to deliver a message personally." "I'm listening." Cole reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "Mr. Whitmore is prepared to offer you $50,000 to walk away. Sign over the deed, vacate the property, and this unpleasantness can be avoided." Marcus looked at the envelope but didn't take it. $50,000. 6 months ago, that would have been life-changing money. Enough to buy a real home, fix his truck, maybe even reconnect with his daughter. But now, standing on land that held a secret worth 5,000 times that amount, the offer felt like an insult. "And if I say no?" Cole's expression hardened. "Then Mr. Whitmore will pursue every legal avenue available to him, and I assure you, Mr. Weber, his resources are considerable. This could drag on for years, cost you everything you have, which, from the looks of it, isn't much." Marcus felt anger flare in his chest, hot and sharp. He thought about all the years he had spent serving his country, all the sacrifices he had made, all the pieces of himself he had left scattered across foreign soil. And now this man, this lawyer in his expensive suit, was standing on his land, threatening him, trying to take what was rightfully his. "Get off my property," Marcus said quietly. Cole blinked. "Excuse me?" "I said get off my property. You delivered your message. Now leave." The younger man stepped forward, his posture aggressive. "You might want to reconsider." "I'm not reconsidering anything." Marcus's voice was steady, but there was steel beneath it. The voice of a man who had faced real threats, not paper ones. "I bought this land legally. I own it, and no amount of money or lawyers is going to change that. So take your envelope, get in your fancy car, and go back to Seattle. Tell Mr. Whitmore that if he wants this land, he'll have to fight for it. and I've been fighting my whole life." For a long moment, no one moved. Then Cole tucked the envelope back into his jacket and smiled that cold, empty smile again. "Have it your way, Mr. Weber, but don't say we didn't give you a chance." They turned and walked back to the SUV. Marcus watched until the vehicle disappeared down the road, his hands clenched at his sides. He knew he had just made an enemy, a powerful one. But he also knew that he couldn't back down. Not now, not after everything he had been through. This land was his, that bunker was his, and no one, not lawyers, not distant relatives, not anyone, was going to take it from him. The confrontation with Cole marked a turning point. Within days, Marcus began to notice things. A car parked on the road at night, its lights off, footprints near the property line that didn't belong to him. A sense of being watched that prickled at the back of his neck like a warning. He started sleeping with his wrench beside him. It wasn't much, but it was something. And then, one evening, Earl Hensley showed up again. This time, he wasn't alone. Marcus heard the trucks before he saw them, a convoy of 3 rumbling up the drive in a cloud of dust. He stepped out of the barn, tension coiling in his muscles, ready for another confrontation. But the men who climbed out of those trucks weren't lawyers. They were veterans. Earl was in the lead, his white hair bright against the fading light. Behind him came 5 others, ranging in age from early 30s to late 60s. They wore flannel and denim, work boots and ball caps. Several had patches on their jackets, unit insignias, campaign ribbons, the quiet markers of service that civilians rarely noticed. "Marcus," Earl said, nodding in greeting, "brought some friends. Hope you don't mind." Marcus looked at the assembled group, confusion and caution warring in his chest. "What is this?" "Word travels fast in small towns," Earl explained. "Heard about your visitors the other day. Heard about the lawsuit. Figured you might need some backup." One of the younger men stepped forward. He was maybe 35, broad-shouldered, with a beard that couldn't quite hide the scar running along his jawline. "Name's Jesse, Marine Corps, 2 tours in Iraq. Earl told us what's happening. We came to help." "Help how?" Jesse shrugged. "However you need, extra eyes, extra hands, whatever it takes." He paused. "We look out for our own." Marcus didn't know what to say. He had spent so long alone, so long convinced that no one cared, that the world had forgotten him. And now here were strangers, fellow veterans, offering their support without asking for anything in return. His throat tightened. He had to look away for a moment, blinking hard. "I don't—" he started, then stopped, tried again. "I can't pay you anything." "Didn't ask for payment," Earl said simply. "Asked for nothing. We're here because it's right." The other men nodded. One of them, an older black man with grey in his beard and kindness in his eyes, spoke up. "I'm Thomas. Army, same as you. Served in Desert Storm. Lost my farm to a bank 3 years ago. Lawyers, paperwork, the whole 9 yards. Wish someone had stood with me then. Maybe things would have been different." Another man, younger, with nervous energy crackling off him like static, added, "I'm Rick, National Guard, Afghanistan 2012. I know what it's like to come home and feel like nobody gives a damn. This," he gestured at the group, "this is what's supposed to happen. This is what community means." Marcus looked at each of them in turn. These men didn't know about the bunker, didn't know about the gold. All they knew was that a fellow veteran was being threatened, and they had come to stand beside him. It was the most human thing anyone had done for him in years. "Okay," he said finally, his voice rough. "Okay, thank you." Earl smiled. "That's more like it. Now, let's get to work." Over the following weeks, the property transformed. The veterans came in shifts, 2 or 3 at a time, bringing tools and supplies and expertise. They reinforced the barn, turning it into a proper shelter. They cleared the debris from the farmhouse site and laid the foundation for a small cabin. They strung wire along the property line and installed motion sensor lights powered by a generator Jesse had found at a surplus auction. Marcus worked alongside them, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, he felt like part of something. Not alone, not forgotten, part of a team. They didn't ask about the bunker. He didn't tell them. But he made a silent promise to himself. When this was over, when the legal battle was settled and the dust had cleared, he would find a way to repay their kindness. Somehow. Then Danny showed up. It was late afternoon on a Saturday, the sky heavy with clouds that promised snow. Marcus was splitting firewood behind the barn when he heard footsteps approaching. He turned to find a young man standing at the edge of the clearing, early 20s, thin as a rail, with hollow cheeks and eyes that held a kind of desperate exhaustion Marcus recognized immediately. He had seen that look in the mirror not so long ago. "Can I help you?" Marcus asked, setting down the axe. The young man hesitated. "I'm looking for work. Heard there was a veteran out here fixing up the old Callahan place. Thought maybe—" He trailed off, shifting his weight from foot to foot. "You a veteran?" "Yes, sir. Army. One tour. Afghanistan, 2020. He swallowed hard. "Came home 6 months ago. Been struggling." Marcus studied him. The kid was barely holding himself together. His clothes were worn, his boots held together with tape, and there was a tremor in his hands that suggested either cold or withdrawal. Maybe both. "What's your name?" "Danny. Danny Reyes." Marcus nodded slowly. "You got a place to stay, Danny?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Marcus thought about all the nights he had spent in his truck, cold and hungry and alone. He thought about the people who had walked past him, the family who had closed their doors, the world that had turned its back. And he thought about Earl and Jesse and Thomas and the others who had shown up when he needed them most. "There's a cot in the barn," he said finally. "It's not much, but it's warm. You can stay there tonight. Tomorrow we'll figure out something more permanent." Danny's eyes widened. I don't have any money." "Didn't ask for money. Asked for nothing." Marcus picked up the axe and handed it to him. "But if you want to stay, you work. Deal?" Danny took the axe like it was a lifeline. Deal. That night, as the first snow of the season began to fall, Marcus sat by the propane heater in the barn and watched Danny sleep. The kid was curled up on the cot, wrapped in the sleeping bag Marcus had bought weeks ago, his face peaceful for the first time since he had arrived. Marcus thought about Howard Callahan, alone in his bunker, surrounded by gold and fear. He thought about the letter, the final testament of a man who had spent his life preparing for a disaster that never came. "I hope you use what I have gathered not to hide, but to build, not to fear, but to hope." For the first time, Marcus began to understand what those words really meant. It wasn't about the money. It never had been. It was about what the money could do, the lives it could change, the hope it could restore. He looked at Danny, at this broken young man who had wandered onto his land looking for work, but finding something more, and he made another promise, this one spoken aloud into the quiet darkness. "I'm going to do something good with this," he whispered. "I don't know how yet, but I'm going to make it matter." The snow continued to fall, soft and silent, covering the land in a blanket of white, and somewhere beneath it all, $260 million waited in the darkness, patient as stone. The lawsuit dragged on through the winter. Preston Whitmore's lawyers filed motion after motion, challenging the auction, demanding depositions, requesting continuances. Walter fought back with equal tenacity, but the process was slow and grinding, like two glaciers colliding in slow motion. Marcus used the time to prepare. With the help of the veterans, he built a small cabin on the property. Nothing fancy, just a single room with a wood stove, a bed, and a tiny kitchen. But it was his. 4 walls and a roof that didn't belong to anyone else. For a man who had spent years without a home, it felt like a palace. Danny stayed on, proving himself to be a hard worker once he got clean. The first few weeks were rough. Sweats, shakes, nightmares that woke them both in the middle of the night. But Marcus had been through his own hell, and he knew how to sit with someone in the darkness without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed quickly. He just stayed, and slowly, Danny began to heal. By February, the kid was almost unrecognizable. He had gained weight, his hands were steady, and there was a light in his eyes that hadn't been there before. He still had bad days, they both did, but the bad days were getting fewer. "You saved my life," Danny told him one evening as they sat by the fire. "You know that, right?" Marcus shook his head. "I just gave you a place to sleep. You did the rest." "No," Danny insisted. "You gave me a chance. Nobody else would. I knocked on 100 doors before I found yours. You were the only one who opened it." Marcus didn't know how to respond to that. He had never thought of himself as someone who saved people. He was the one who needed saving, the one who had failed at everything that mattered. But looking at Danny now, seeing the man he was becoming, Marcus felt something he hadn't felt in years: pride. The breakthrough came in early March. Walter called with news that Preston Whitmore's lawyers had made a critical error. In their eagerness to challenge the auction, they had filed paperwork claiming that the property had been improperly surveyed in 1992. But Walter had found records proving that the survey was accurate, and more importantly, that Whitmore's own father had acknowledged the property boundaries in a letter from 1989. "They basically torpedoed their own case," Walter explained, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "The judge threw out their latest motion and issued a warning about frivolous litigation. Whitmore can still appeal, but at this point, he's throwing good money after bad." Marcus let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "So it's over?" "Not quite. Give it another month or two for the dust to settle. But barring something unexpected, the property is yours. Lock, stock, and barrel." "And the bunker?" "Same rules apply. Whatever's on the property belongs to the property owner. That's you." Walter paused. "But Marcus, once this is settled, you need to think seriously about what comes next. $260 million doesn't stay secret forever. People will find out, and when they do, everything changes." "I know," Marcus said quietly. "I've been thinking about that." "And?" Marcus looked out the window of his cabin at the snow-covered land beyond, at the barn where Danny was splitting firewood, at the tracks in the snow where Earl and the others had come and gone, week after week, asking nothing, giving everything. "I want to do something good with it," he said. "Something that helps people, veterans especially, guys like Danny, guys like me, people who fell through the cracks." Walter was quiet for a moment. "That's a big undertaking." "I know. But Howard Callahan spent his whole life preparing for a disaster that never came. He died alone, surrounded by gold he never used. I don't want to be like him. I want the money to mean something." "Then we'll make it mean something," Walter said, "together. But first, let's win this fight, one step at a time." "One step at a time," Marcus agreed. He hung up the phone and stood there for a while, watching Danny work. The kid moved with purpose now, with confidence. He was building something, not just firewood piles, but a life, a future. Marcus thought about his own future, about the possibilities that lay ahead. For so long, he had seen his life as a series of endings: the end of his marriage, the end of his career, the end of his relationship with his daughter. But maybe, just maybe, he was standing at a beginning instead. The snow was starting to melt, spring was coming, and with it, the chance to build something new, something good, something that mattered. Marcus walked outside and picked up an axe. Danny looked up, surprised. "Thought you were making calls," the kid said. "Finished?" Marcus positioned a log on the chopping block. "Figured I'd help out." Danny grinned. "About time. I was starting to think you'd gone soft." Marcus laughed, a real laugh, warm and genuine, and swung the axe. The blade bit deep into the wood, splitting it clean in two. Behind him, the mountains stood tall and patient, their peaks still white with winter snow. Beneath his feet, a fortune waited in the darkness. And all around him, the seeds of something beautiful were beginning to take root. The battle wasn't over yet, but for the first time in years, Marcus Weber believed he might actually win. Not just the lawsuit, not just the money, but something far more valuable. A second chance at life, and this time he wasn't going to waste it. Spring arrived in the Montana mountains like a promise finally kept. The snow retreated up the slopes, revealing green meadows dotted with wildflowers. Streams swelled with meltwater, their voices filling the valleys with a constant musical rush. And on the property that had once belonged to Howard Callahan, Marcus Weber stood on the porch of his small cabin and watched the world come back to life. It had been 4 months since the confrontation with Preston Whitmore's lawyers. 4 months of waiting, worrying, and working. But Walter had been right. The legal challenge had crumbled under the weight of its own contradictions. The judge dismissed Whitmore's final appeal in late March, citing insufficient evidence and a pattern of frivolous filings. The ruling was decisive and final. The land was his, every acre, every structure, every secret buried beneath the soil. Marcus had read the decision 3 times before he believed it. Then he had walked out to the hidden hatch, brushed away the last of the winter debris, and stood there in the morning light, trying to process what it meant. $260 million, his. Legally, irrevocably, his. The weight of it was staggering. Not the money itself, but the responsibility. What do you do with a fortune you never expected? How do you handle wealth when you've spent years learning to survive on nothing? For Howard Callahan, the answer had been fear. He had buried his treasure and waited for a disaster that never came, dying alone in a world that kept spinning without him. Marcus refused to follow that path. He had seen too much darkness to retreat into it willingly. He had lost too much to waste what he had been given. The question wasn't whether to use the money, the question was how. The answer came to him slowly, over weeks of conversation and contemplation. He talked with Walter about legal structures and tax implications. He talked with Earl about the needs of the local community. He talked with Danny about what it meant to be a veteran coming home to a country that didn't know how to help you. And gradually, a vision began to take shape. It started with a name, the Callahan Monroe Veterans Foundation. Marcus chose the name deliberately. Callahan, for the man who had built the bunker and gathered the fortune. A World War II veteran who deserved to be remembered for more than his fear. And Monroe, his mother's maiden name, because despite everything, she was still part of who he was. The foundation would be a bridge between past and present, between one veteran's legacy and another's redemption. Walter helped him navigate the paperwork. Establishing a charitable foundation was complicated, especially one funded by assets as unusual as gold bars and bearer bonds. There were appraisals to conduct, taxes to pay, legal structures to build. It took months of work and cost more than Marcus had expected, but by midsummer, the Callahan Monroe Veterans Foundation was officially registered as a 501c3 non-profit organization, with Marcus Weber as its founding director. The first project was housing. Marcus had spent too many nights sleeping in his truck, too many mornings waking up cold and stiff and ashamed. He knew what it felt like to have nowhere to go, to be invisible to a world that kept moving without you. And he knew he wasn't alone. Across the country, tens of thousands of veterans were homeless on any given night. Many more were one paycheck away from joining them. He bought a 20-acre parcel adjacent to his property and began construction on what he called Waypoint Village, a community of small, sturdy cabins designed to provide transitional housing for veterans in crisis. Each cabin was simple but dignified, a bedroom, a bathroom, a small kitchen, and a living area. Nothing fancy, but warm and safe and private. A place to breathe, a place to heal. Danny was the first official employee of the foundation. Marcus hired him as site manager, responsible for overseeing construction and coordinating with the contractors. It was more responsibility than Danny had ever held, and at first he was terrified of failing. "What if I mess it up?" he asked Marcus one evening, his voice tight with anxiety. "What if I let you down?" Marcus looked at him steadily. "You won't." "How do you know?" "Because I know what you've survived, and anyone who can make it through what you made it through can handle a construction project." He paused. "Besides, I'll be right here. We're in this together." Danny nodded slowly, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. Together. Together. The cabins went up faster than Marcus had expected. Word spread through the veteran community, and volunteers began showing up, some to work, others just to watch, to see if the rumors were true. A foundation run by veterans for veterans, a place where people actually gave a damn. By autumn, the first 6 cabins were complete. Marcus stood at the entrance to Waypoint Village on a crisp October morning, watching as the inaugural residents arrived. There was a woman in her 50s who had served as a medic in the Gulf War and lost her apartment after a medical emergency wiped out her savings. There was a young man barely older than Danny who had come home from Syria with injuries that made it impossible to work his old construction job. There was an elderly Korean War veteran who had been living in his car for 3 years, too proud to ask for help until someone from the VA finally connected him with the foundation. Each of them received a cabin, a case manager, and access to services, mental health counseling, job training, financial literacy classes. The goal wasn't just to give them a roof, but to give them a path forward, to help them rebuild one step at a time. Marcus shook each resident's hand as they arrived. When the Korean War veteran, a small, wiry man named George, gripped his hand, there were tears in the old man's eyes. "I never thought," George started, then stopped, overwhelmed. "I never thought anyone cared." Marcus held his grip steady. "We care, and you're not alone anymore." George nodded, unable to speak. Then he walked toward his cabin, his shoulders straighter than they had been in years. Danny appeared at Marcus's side, watching the residents settle in. "We did it," he said quietly. "We actually did it." "We did," Marcus agreed. "But this is just the beginning." "What's next?" Marcus looked out at the mountains, their peaks already dusted with early snow. "Everything." The foundation grew faster than anyone anticipated. The housing program was just the start. By the following spring, Marcus had launched 3 additional initiatives: a job training center that partnered with local businesses to place veterans in skilled trades, a mental health program that provided free counseling and peer support groups, and an emergency assistance fund that helped veterans facing sudden crises, eviction notices, medical bills, car repairs, stay on their feet. The money flowed outward like water finding its level. Marcus was careful, methodical, always conscious of the responsibility he carried. He hired financial advisors and established oversight committees. He created transparent reporting systems so that every dollar could be tracked. He wanted the foundation to be above reproach, a model of what charitable work could look like when it was done right. But he also understood that money alone wasn't enough. What veterans needed most wasn't charity, it was community, connection, the knowledge that someone understood what they had been through and valued their service. That's why he decided to open the bunker. The idea had been growing in his mind for months. Howard Callahan had built the shelter out of fear, but the structure itself was remarkable. A testament to Cold War engineering, to an era when Americans genuinely believed the world might end at any moment. It deserved to be seen. It deserved to be understood. More importantly, it could serve a purpose beyond storage. Marcus worked with architects and historians to transform the underground complex into a museum. The gold and valuables had long since been moved to secure facilities, converted to cash that now funded the foundation's work. But the bunker itself remained, its stone walls and steel doors preserved exactly as Howard had left them. The museum told two stories. The first was the story of the Cold War, the fear, the preparations, the nuclear drills that sent children diving under desks. Visitors could walk through the corridors, see the supply rooms and generator stations, read the civil defense manuals that had guided a generation's nightmares. But the second story was more personal. It was Howard's story, told through his letters and photographs and the meticulous records he had kept. And it was Marcus's story too, the journey from homeless veteran to Foundation director, from despair to purpose. The museum didn't shy away from the hard truths, the failures of the VA system, the epidemic of veteran homelessness, the suicide rates that climbed higher every year, but it also offered hope. It showed what was possible when people chose to act. The grand opening was held on Veterans Day, almost 2 years after Marcus had first descended those stone steps. More than 300 people attended. Veterans, families, local officials, even a few reporters who had heard whispers of the remarkable story unfolding in rural Montana. Marcus stood at the entrance to the bunker, the same spot where he had once stood alone and terrified and welcomed visitors to the Callahan Monroe Heritage Center. This place was built by a man who was afraid, he told the crowd, afraid of war, afraid of loss, afraid of a future he couldn't control. He spent his life preparing for the worst, and in doing so he missed the best. He died alone, surrounded by treasure he never used. Marcus paused, looking out at the faces before him. He saw veterans in wheelchairs. He saw children holding their parents' hands. He saw Earl and Jesse and Thomas and all the others who had stood with him when he had nothing to offer but need. I was afraid too, he continued, afraid of my memories, afraid of my failures, afraid that I was beyond saving. But this place taught me something. It taught me that fear doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning. Because when you finally stop running from what scares you, you find the strength to build something better. He gestured toward the bunker entrance. Howard Callahan gathered a fortune and hid it in the dark. Today, we bring it into the light. Not as gold or silver, but as hope, as housing, as healing, as a promise to every veteran who ever felt forgotten. You are not alone. You matter, and we will never stop fighting for you. The applause that followed was thunderous, but Marcus barely heard it. His eyes had found someone in the crowd, a teenage girl standing near the back, half hidden behind a group of older visitors. She had dark hair and dark eyes, and she was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. His heart stopped. Emma. She was 16 now, taller than he remembered, her face thinner, more mature. But he would have recognized her anywhere. She was his daughter, his little girl, the one he had walked away from because he thought she deserved better than a broken father. Their eyes met across the crowd. Emma didn't smile, didn't wave. She just stood there, watching, waiting. Marcus forced himself to finish his speech, to thank the donors and volunteers, to officially declare the Heritage Center open. But his mind was elsewhere, racing through possibilities and fears. Why was she here? How had she found him? What did she want? When the ceremony ended and the crowd began to disperse into the bunker for tours, Marcus made his way toward the spot where Emma had been standing. For a terrible moment, he thought she had left, that he had imagined her, conjured her from desperate hope. But she was there, waiting by the tree line, arms crossed, jaw set with the same stubborn determination he saw in the mirror every morning. They stood facing each other for what felt like hours. Neither spoke. The wind rustled through the pine trees, carrying the scent of snow and possibility. Finally, Emma broke the silence. "You look different." Marcus swallowed hard. "You too. Mum showed me the news story about the foundation, about—" She gestured toward the bunker. "All of this. I wanted to tell you myself. I didn't know how." "You could have called." I tried once a long time ago. I couldn't find the words. Emma's expression flickered. Anger, hurt, something softer beneath. Do you know how many nights I waited for you to call? How many birthdays? How many Christmases? The words hit Marcus like physical blows. He had told himself he was protecting her, that his absence was a gift. But standing here now, seeing the pain in her eyes, he understood the truth. He had been a coward. He had run from the hard work of being present, of being imperfect, of letting his daughter see him struggle and fail and try again. I'm sorry, he said, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry, Emma. I thought you were better off without me. I thought... He shook his head. It doesn't matter what I thought. I was wrong. I was wrong, and I hurt you, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make it right. Emma stared at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, her arms uncrossed. I came here to be angry, she said quietly. I had a whole speech prepared, all the things I wanted to say, all the ways you failed me. You have every right to be angry. I know. She took a breath. But then I saw what you built. I talked to some of the veterans. I heard their stories, and I realized... She paused, searching for words. I realized that you weren't just running away from us. You were running away from yourself, from whatever happened over there that you couldn't talk about. Marcus nodded, unable to speak. I'm not saying I forgive you, Emma continued. I'm not saying everything's okay, but I'm here, and I want to understand. I want to know who you are now, who you're trying to be. Marcus felt tears sliding down his cheeks. He didn't try to hide them. I'm trying to be someone worthy of you, he said. Someone you could be proud of. I know I have a long way to go, but I'm trying. Every day, I'm trying. Emma studied him for a moment. Then, hesitantly, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him. Marcus held his daughter for the first time in years. She was taller now, almost his height, but she still fit against him the same way she had when she was small. He breathed in the scent of her hair and felt something inside him, something that had been broken for so long, finally begin to heal. They stayed like that for a long time, two people who had lost each other finding their way back. When they finally separated, Emma wiped her eyes and managed a small smile. So, want to show me around this bunker of yours? Marcus laughed through his tears. Yeah, I'd like that. They walked together toward the entrance, father and daughter, beginning a conversation that would take years to finish. But they had time. For the first time in forever, they had time. The months that followed were the richest of Marcus's life. Emma returned to Ridgecrest 3 more times before the year ended. First for Thanksgiving, then for Christmas, then for a long weekend in February when the snow lay thick on the ground and they spent hours talking by the fire in Marcus's cabin. The conversations were sometimes painful, excavating old wounds that had never properly healed. But they were also clarifying, like cleaning out an infected cut so it could finally close. Marcus learned things about Emma's life that he had missed, her struggles in school after he left, the counseling sessions that helped her process her anger, the boyfriend who had broken her heart junior year. He learned that she wanted to study psychology in college, that she hoped to work with veterans someday, that she had inherited his stubbornness and her mother's grace. And Emma learned about her father, not just the soldier who had come home broken, but the man who was rebuilding himself piece by piece. She toured the Waypoint Village cabins and met the residents whose lives had been transformed. She sat in on a peer support group and listened to veterans share their stories. She walked through the Heritage Center and read Howard Callahan's letters, understanding for the first time the weight her father had carried. He was alone his whole life, she said, standing before the display case that held Howard's final letter. Even with all that money, all that preparation, he was completely alone. Fear does that, Marcus replied. It convinces you that isolation is safety, that vulnerability is weakness. I believed that for a long time. What changed? Marcus thought about Earl showing up at his barn, about the veterans who had come to help without being asked, about Danny, broken and desperate, finding his way to the one door that would open. People, he said finally. People who refused to let me disappear. Emma nodded slowly. I want to help, she said. When I finish school, I want to work here. I want to be part of this. Marcus felt his heart swell. There's nothing I'd want more. Sarah never came back. Marcus made peace with that. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. But she had raised Emma well, raised her to be strong and compassionate and brave. For that, Marcus would always be grateful. He sent her a letter once, thanking her for keeping their daughter safe during the years he couldn't. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He just wanted her to know that he understood what she had sacrificed. She never replied, but Emma told him that Sarah had read the letter and that she had cried. It was enough. The foundation continued to grow. Within 2 years, Waypoint Village had expanded to 24 cabins, providing housing for nearly 50 veterans at any given time. The Job Training Center had placed more than 200 veterans in skilled positions with a retention rate that exceeded 85%. The mental health program had helped countless individuals access therapy and support, and the emergency fund had prevented dozens of evictions and crises. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real impact was in the faces Marcus saw every day. The veteran who had arrived suicidal and was now mentoring others through their darkest moments. The woman who had lost everything and was now running the Foundation's financial literacy program. The young father who had gotten clean, found work, and was rebuilding his relationship with his kids. These were the miracles. Small, quiet, unremarkable to anyone who didn't know what had come before. But Marcus knew. And every time he saw someone climb back from the edge, he felt Howard Callahan's words echo in his mind. I hope you use what I have gathered not to hide but to build, not to fear but to hope. Danny became the Foundation's first success story and its most powerful advocate. 3 years after stumbling onto Marcus's property, he was sober, healthy, and engaged to a nurse named Rachel, whom he had met at a Foundation fundraiser. He spoke at events across the state, sharing his journey with unflinching honesty. I was dead, he would tell audiences. Not physically, but inside. I had given up. I had decided that my life wasn't worth living. He would pause, letting the weight of those words settle. And then a stranger opened his door. He didn't ask what I could give him, he asked what I needed, and he gave it freely with no expectation of return. Danny would gesture toward Marcus, usually standing in the back of the room, uncomfortable with the attention. That man saved my life. Not with money, though the money helped. He saved me by believing I was worth saving, by refusing to give up on me when I had already given up on myself. Danny's voice would crack, but he never stopped. That's what this foundation is about. Not charity, not pity, just people helping people, one day at a time. And if you're sitting out there thinking it's too late for you, that you're too broken, too lost, too far gone, I'm living proof that you're wrong. The applause at these moments was always deafening. But for Marcus, the real reward was simpler. It was watching Danny stand tall, transformed, alive. It was knowing that the fortune buried beneath the frozen Montana soil had become something Howard Callahan never imagined. A force for healing in a broken world. The Heritage Center became a destination for school groups across the Northwest. Buses arrived weekly, filled with children who would walk through the underground corridors and learn about a time when nuclear war seemed not just possible, but probable. They would see the civil defense posters, the ration supplies, the communication equipment designed to function after the end of the world. But the part that stayed with them, the part they talked about on the bus ride home, was always the veteran stories. The Foundation had created an oral history project, recording interviews with veterans from every conflict since World War II. These recordings played throughout the museum, voices emerging from the stone walls like ghosts made manifest. An 87-year-old man described landing on Omaha Beach, the water red with blood, the sand churning with fire. A woman in her 60s recounted treating wounded soldiers in a field hospital during the Tet Offensive, holding hands with boys who would never see their mothers again. A young veteran, barely older than the high school students listening, spoke about the guilt of surviving when his best friend had not, about the nightmares that still woke him screaming, about the long road back to something like peace. These stories did what textbooks never could. They made the past real. They made service tangible. And they reminded every visitor that the freedoms they enjoyed had been purchased with sacrifice most of them would never fully understand. Marcus gave tours himself sometimes, especially for veteran groups. He would lead them through the corridors, past the displays and the artifacts, until they reached the stone chamber where Howard's fortune had once been stored. The vault was empty now, but the space remained, preserved as a reminder. "This is where it all began," Marcus would say. "A man spent his life filling this room with gold because he was afraid of the future. He thought wealth would protect him from the world. But all it did was isolate him. He died alone, surrounded by treasure he never used." He would pause, letting the visitors absorb the space, the cold stone walls, the heavy vault door, the silence that pressed in from all sides. "I found this place at the lowest point of my life. I had lost my family, my health, my hope. I was living in my truck, eating canned beans, trying to figure out how to survive another winter. And then I discovered a fortune that could have let me disappear forever. I could have taken the money and run, bought an island somewhere, lived out my days in comfort and solitude." Marcus would shake his head. But Howard tried that, and it didn't save him. It just made his loneliness permanent. He would look at the veterans surrounding him, men and women who had seen things most people couldn't imagine. What saved me wasn't money. It was connection. It was veterans who showed up when I needed them, who stood with me when I had nothing to offer in return. It was my daughter who came back even after I had given her every reason to stay away. It was learning, slowly, painfully, that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's the beginning of strength. He would gesture toward the empty vault. This room used to hold $260 million. Now it holds something more valuable, a reminder that the treasures that matter can't be locked in a vault. They're found in the people who love us, the communities that support us, the work we do to lift each other up. Howard Callahan forgot that lesson. I almost did too. But thanks to the people who refused to give up on me, I got a second chance. His voice would soften. All of you have had moments when you felt lost, when the world seemed dark and hope seemed impossible. I know because I've been there. But I'm standing here today, alive, purposeful, grateful, because someone believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. That's what this foundation is about. That's what this museum is about. Not gold, not glory. Just humans helping humans find their way home. The silence that followed these talks was always profound, and more than once Marcus had seen hardened veterans, men and women who had faced death without flinching, wipe tears from their eyes. On the 5th anniversary of the Foundation's founding, Marcus stood at the entrance to the Heritage Center and watched a group of schoolchildren stream out of the bunker, their voices echoing across the parking lot. Their teacher, a young woman with braids and a kind smile, lingered behind to shake his hand. "Thank you," she said. "My grandfather served in Korea. He never talked about it, not once in his whole life. But today, listening to those recordings, I felt like I finally understood something about him, about what he carried." Marcus nodded. "That's why we do this, so the stories don't get lost, so the sacrifices mean something to the people who come after." The teacher smiled and rejoined her students. Marcus watched them load onto the bus, their excited chatter fading as the vehicle pulled away. Emma appeared beside him, a clipboard in her hand and a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She had finished her psychology degree the previous spring and had immediately joined the foundation's staff, just as she had promised. She ran the peer support programs now, bringing the same fierce compassion to her work that she brought to everything. "The Spring Gala Committee wants to know if you'll give the keynote speech again this year," she said. Marcus groaned. "I gave it last year and the year before that. Can't someone else do it?" "You're the founder, the face of the organization. People want to hear from you. People want to hear stories. They don't need me specifically." Emma grinned. "Too bad. You're doing it anyway." She made a note on her clipboard. "Also, Danny wants to talk to you about expanding the job training program, and there's a reporter from the Times who's been calling about a feature article." "Tell them I'm busy. You always say that. And it's always true." Emma laughed and tucked the clipboard under her arm. "Fine, but eventually you're going to have to accept that you've built something people care about, something that matters." Marcus looked at her, his daughter, his miracle, the living proof that broken things could be healed. "I know it matters," he said quietly. "I just don't need anyone to tell me that. What matters is the work, the people we help. Everything else is noise." Emma studied him for a moment. Then she reached out and squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of you, Dad. You know that, right?" Marcus felt his throat tighten. "Yeah, I know." "Good. Now go talk to Danny. He's been pacing around the village for an hour, and I think he's starting to scare the residents." Marcus laughed and headed toward the cabins, his heart full in a way he had never expected. 5 years ago he had been alone in the world. Broken, ready to disappear. Now he had a daughter who loved him, a community that valued him, a purpose that gave meaning to every day he was granted. And beneath his feet, in a stone chamber that had once held a fortune in gold, there was nothing but empty space and the echo of a promise kept. As Marcus approached the Waypoint village, he saw Danny waiting by the entrance, bouncing on his heels with barely contained energy. Rachel was beside him, her hand resting on her rounded belly. They were expecting their first child in 3 months, a girl, they had told him, whom they planned to name Hope. "Marcus," Danny called out. "Finally! I've been waiting forever." "Emma said you wanted to talk about the job training expansion." "Yes, but also—" Danny glanced at Rachel, who nodded encouragingly. "We want you to be the godfather, officially, if you're willing." Marcus stopped walking. For a moment he couldn't speak. "You don't have to answer now," Rachel added quickly. "We know it's a big ask, but Danny wouldn't be here without you. Neither of us would, and we want our daughter to know the man who made our family possible." Marcus looked at Danny, the broken young man who had stumbled onto his property 5 years ago, barely alive, ready to give up. Now he stood tall and healthy, engaged to a woman who adored him, about to become a father. This was what the foundation was for, not statistics or press coverage or gala speeches. This. "I would be honored," Marcus said, his voice rough with emotion. Danny's face split into a grin. He stepped forward and embraced Marcus, holding tight. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything, for seeing me when nobody else would." Marcus held him close. "You did the hard work, Danny. I just opened a door. Sometimes that's all it takes." They separated, both of them wiping their eyes. Rachel laughed and handed them tissues. "You two are ridiculous," she said fondly. "Now come inside. I made lunch, and you're both eating whether you want to or not." Marcus followed them into the cabin, surrounded by warmth and laughter and love. This was his life now. Not the soldier he had been, not the broken man who had lost everything. But this, father figure, community builder, guardian of hope. Howard Callahan had gathered a fortune because he feared the future. Marcus had inherited that fortune and transformed it into something else entirely, a testament to what was possible when fear gave way to faith. The bunker still stood beneath the mountain, its stone walls silent and cool. The vault was empty, But the legacy remained, not in gold, but in lives changed, families healed, veterans brought back from the edge. Anyone can rebuild what's been broken if they're brave enough to believe there's still something worth saving. That evening, after the sun had set and the stars had emerged in their ancient patterns, Marcus walked alone to the entrance of the Heritage Center. The building was closed for the night, the parking lot empty, the world quiet except for the wind through the pines. He descended the stone steps one more time, flashlight in hand, his footsteps echoing in the familiar darkness. He walked through the corridors, past the exhibits and displays, until he reached the stone chamber at the heart of the complex. The vault door stood open, as it always did now. Inside, there was nothing but bare walls and empty space, and a single brass plaque that Marcus had installed during the renovation. He shone his light on the words engraved there. In memory of Howard Ellsworth Callahan, 1919 to 1987, soldier, builder, dreamer. He gathered a fortune in gold, but his true legacy is measured in lives transformed. May we all find the courage to use what we have been given, not to hide from the world, but to heal it. Marcus stood there for a long time, thinking about the man who had built this place, thinking about the fear that had driven him, the loneliness that had consumed him, the treasure he had accumulated and never spent. Howard had believed the world would end. He had prepared for catastrophe, for collapse, for the failure of everything he knew. And in doing so, he had missed the simple truth. The world kept spinning, people kept living, and the only disasters that truly destroyed him were the ones he created himself. Marcus understood that now. He had walked the same path, made the same mistakes. He had hidden from his family, from his feelings, from any possibility of connection. He had convinced himself that isolation was safety, that loneliness was freedom, that he was protecting the people he loved by staying away. But he had been wrong, profoundly, utterly wrong. The treasure had never been the gold. It had never been the money or the power or the security that wealth could buy. The treasure was the people who showed up when you needed them, the daughter who came back even after you gave her every reason to stay away, the strangers who became family, the broken souls who found their way to your door and somehow, in helping them heal, helped you heal too. Howard Callahan had missed that lesson, but Marcus had learned it, slowly and painfully and beautifully. And now, standing in the empty vault where a fortune had once gathered dust, he made one final promise. "I won't waste it," he said aloud, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "I won't hide. I won't let fear win. Whatever time I have left, I'll use it to build something that matters, something that lasts, something worthy of the second chance I was given." The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of memory, full of gratitude, full of hope. Marcus Weber turned off his flashlight and climbed the stone steps for the last time that day. He emerged into the cool Montana night, the stars wheeling overhead in their eternal dance. Behind him, the bunker held its secrets. Beneath his feet, the earth held its history. And all around him, the world kept spinning, full of broken people searching for light. He had found his light. Against all odds, against all expectations, against everything he had believed about himself. And now it was his job to share it, one veteran at a time, one life at a time, one day at a time, forever. As the first light of dawn crept over the Montana mountains, Marcus Weber stood on the porch of his cabin and watched a new group of residents arrive at Waypoint Village. They climbed out of cars and buses, their faces uncertain, their shoulders heavy with invisible burdens. But they had come. They had taken the first step, and that meant everything. Danny was there to greet them, his arm around Rachel, their daughter Hope, now 3 months old, and sleeping peacefully against her mother's chest. Emma stood nearby, clipboard in hand, ready to begin the intake process. And scattered throughout the village were the others, Veterans who had once been just as lost, just as broken, just as convinced that their stories were over. Now they stood tall, ready to welcome the newcomers, to share their journeys, to prove that healing was possible. Marcus watched them all, his heart full beyond measure. 6 years ago, he had been alone in the world, broken, abandoned by everyone who was supposed to love him. He had bought a piece of worthless land for $1,200, expecting nothing, hoping for nothing. Instead, he had found everything: a fortune beyond imagining, a purpose beyond price, a family rebuilt from the ashes of his failures, and a lesson he would carry until his final breath: that the greatest treasures are never found in vaults or buried beneath the earth. They are found in the hands we hold, the wounds we heal, the lives we touch with courage and compassion. Anyone can change the world if they're brave enough to start with themselves. That is the story of Marcus Weber, soldier, survivor, builder of hope. And the road ahead? Well, that's a story yet to be written. But he was ready. For the first time in his life, he was truly ready. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories waiting for you. Click to keep the journey going, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe that second chances are worth fighting for.